I'd like to introduce Judith Orr as our speaker. Judith is a member of the SWP and an activist, particularly in abortion rights, but a number of different campaigns, and she's also an author, and we've got two of her books here today. Her most recent book is The Abortion Wars, The Fight for Reproductive Rights, but she's also written on Marxism and women's liberation, and both of these books are available upstairs at Bookmark Store. So Judith will speak for about half an hour, 30 minutes, after which we'll open it up for discussion, and hopefully we'll be able to get in a lot of conclusions. All right, Judith.
Thanks, Siobhan. Right, can you hear me, folks? Okay, well, Festival of the Oppressed. Given some of the commentary that's been referred to, the mainstream commentary that's been referred to in the day, some people might have expected there to be a question mark after the title of this meeting, because they don't actually believe that it is or was a Festival of the Oppressed. And I think that we have seen over the last few weeks some of the regurgitated cliches about the Russian Revolution, one of which is obviously the favourite, which it was a coup. This was asserted on the Today programme in one of their daily updates about the revolution. And the following day they talked about religion and said that Lenin waged war on religion. Well, I'll go through this and see that this was very far from the case. But the words that you don't hear in these sorts of mainstream coverage are freedom, democracy, liberation, emancipation, the things that all of us as revolutionary socialists would associate with a genuine revolutionary process. And of course, revolution is a process. It's not an event. It's not one day, one night, one barricades. It is a process that can take many years. And a coup from above, as it's so often referred to, is really in direct contradiction to any sort of mass social upheaval that is the feature of a genuine social revolution. And I think that when you look at the Russian Revolution and all that we've already heard today, there's absolutely no doubt that it fits absolutely the sense of a genuine social revolution that was a Festival of the Oppressed in a way that had not been seen historically before that. Now, the revolution, we've heard some of the actual history, was started and led by workers, women workers, who actually at the time formed quite a small minority of the population of Russia, of the massive Russian Empire. But that revolution sent not only shockwaves across the whole of that landmass of the Russian Empire, but across the globe. I mean, the fact that Bolshevik is still a word in English now to describe somebody who doesn't put up with stuff is a sign. And the fact that even they were using this in the trenches in northern France, if people saw the Monocle mutineer just repeated, very rarely repeated on the TV in the last few weeks, you'll know how that the impact that had on people who wanted to fight back against war and fight back against the ruling class. But to understand the impact of the revolution and the lessons for a struggle against all forms of oppression, we need to understand two things to start with. One is the revolution exploded out of the objective conditions of society at the time: war, crisis, dictatorship. And on the other hand, you have a situation where the objective situation out of which the revolution exploded created the potential and possibility for another world. At the same time, it was more than just the spontaneous struggle of workers and peasants against an autocratic leadership, against war and against crisis. We have to look at the subjective as well, the conscious intervention of the Bolshevik Party, schooled in Marxist politics, and a vision of change that saw workers as the vanguard of a struggle and revolution that could change the world, but also that could enable the self-emancipation of all of humanity. Engels wrote it like this in the preface to the 1883 edition of the Communist Manifesto. He said, "The exploited and oppressed class, the proletariat, can no longer emancipate itself from the class which exploits and oppresses it, the bourgeoisie, without at the same time forever freeing the whole of society from exploitation, oppression, and class struggles." So the Bolsheviks saw the struggle as offering hope to the millions suffering under the yoke of oppression, whether it was oppression through religion, sexuality, sex, or any aspect of racism, all of the peoples that were oppressed, that were not necessarily at that time part of the working class, were part of the project, if you like, which was to have the self-emancipation of the whole of humanity. No small project, but this is what the Bolsheviks consciously intervened to try to create the situation. And I think it's important just to say as an aside, the misconceptions or the downright lies about the Russian Revolution are not just, the sort of left to the old crusty reactionaries on the Today programme and the other BBC programmes people have referred to. A few weeks ago, I was at the London Feminist Conference here, and it was a big conference, and they had a session on revolutionary women because it was the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. So, several of us thought, oh, that's good, we'll go along to that. Now, Sheila Rowbottom was on the panel, interesting, etc. But then you had the final speaker was Rahita Gupta from the Southall Black Sisters. And in her, she's writing a book and, about patriarchy and everything else. And she's been to Rojava and she was talking about how there the women are challenging patriarchy and everything else. And then she said, so compared to the Russian Revolution, well, the Russian Revolution, it didn't have an emancipatory motive. It wasn't an emancipatory project. Now, me and the other comrades in the room, were utterly frustrated at the lack of ability to be able to challenge this because that was the meeting over when she finished speaking. And to be fair to Sheila Rowbottom, she did try from the platform. But actually, that both represents a political difference we have with her and her analysis. Also, there is an impact, maybe with a more general audience, of the feeling that what happened afterwards, the result of Stalinism and the counter-revolution can overshadow the achievements of those early years. And those were, remember, done in the name of workers' power, even though workers' power was not in control anymore. And so we have to absolutely reassert and constantly reassert the nature of the Russian Revolution as absolutely an emancipatory project. And this is where we have to reject some of the arguments that are thrown at us. One, that actually seeing workers, the working class, as the vanguard of a struggle that can change the world makes us economistic. Makes us that we can't talk about oppression and the other aspects of suffering in society. Or that I've been told sometimes that, I privilege workers, that all I care about is the workers. You don't really care about other oppressed peoples or people that are not, for various reasons, within the working class. Nor is it about workers working on behalf of other people to free them in some sort of, as if they are some elite of liberationary vanguard in the sense that they're going to do this for other people who are incapable of freeing themselves. How Marx put it in the Communist Manifesto, he says, the proletariat, the lowest stratum of our present society, cannot stir, cannot raise itself up without the whole superincumbent strata of official society being sprung up into the air. So he understood, and was trying to argue that the working class has this ability to completely shake up society and throw everything up into the air. And I think that when you look at what the Bolsheviks did, and we heard in that fascinating last workshop, those of you who were there, that the Bolsheviks' actions were based on a theoretical understanding of how oppression fits into society. And actually, for them, fighting oppression, having people fight for their own liberation, was central to their vision of what a socialist society was going to look like. And let's remember, that we, as Marxists, as socialists, we always say that oppression is not just some independent sort of field, if you like, running in parallel to exploitation and capitalism. It's rooted in capitalism. It flows from capitalism, whatever particular oppression we're talking about. And therefore, if we are going to break that, we have to break the society. We have to break that exploitative relationship that's at the heart of capitalism, from which everything else flows. And therefore, there is no contradiction between saying that a workers' revolution, that workers have got specific ability because of their collective strength within the working class to challenge society, but at the same time say that that means they have an ability to lead a revolution and a struggle that can break the yoke of oppression for millions of others. And, when we look at the Bolsheviks and when we look at the idea of the revolution being a festival of the oppressed, people will be familiar with the phrase, and we often use it in the SWP, about that Lenin said there's a revolutionary, you should model yourself on being a tribune of the press, not some trade union bureaucrat or something. That's what you should be, and absolutely. And he was very, very clear. He said revolutions are the festivals of the oppressed and the exploited. At no other time are the masses of the people in a position to come forward so actively as creators of a new social order as at the time of revolution. At such times, the people are capable of performing miracles, if judged by the narrow Philistine scale of gradual process. And that's gradual progress. That is the sense of it, isn't it? How, there's an awful lot of throwing around of the word empowerment, isn't there, really, I think, in recent years. This idea we can be empowered by this, that, and the other. But the real empowerment comes from being part of a class that can actually change things. And this is what he recognised. Now, the other word that's been used a lot today is messy, and I think it's really important to actually acknowledge the messiness of the Russian Revolution. Because if you actually have a project of self-emancipation, then actually there's going to be experiments, there's going to be mistakes, you're going to be testing it out, and things that work and things that don't. And actually when you look back, there was no blueprint of how the world was going to be. In actual fact, the blueprints only really began with the counter-revolution and the imposition of Stalinism, and that's when you knew the genuine emancipatory nature of the Russian Revolution was being crushed. We don't have a blueprint. We don't sit in this room and say, this is how we're going to live, this is how relationships are going to be, this is how... Of course not. We believe that we will all change during a revolution, make ourselves all the more fit to create a real socialist society. But it is sometimes easy, because we're looking in hindsight and reading it in history books, to sort of see the revolution as some sort of predestined linear progress to a certain spot that was always going to happen this way, that there was never any other way it could have been, that just flowed out of objective conditions, but that this is how it's going to be. And I think we have to keep coming back to, at every point, the priorities and the direction of the revolution were fought for. There was a tension, there was arguments, and that sense of contestation of every move was always there. And I don't mean just between the Bolsheviks and other people in the working class, or the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. I mean, as we've heard, even within the Bolshevik party and the Bolshevik leadership, a constant argument and debate about the way forward and what to do. And so when we look and assess the nature of what the revolution was able to do in terms of oppression and fighting back, we have to do many things at once. We do want to look at the decrees, the proclamations, and the new legal structures, because they were both measures of the intent, if you like, of the leadership of the revolution, the people who fought for it. But we also want to look at what was going on the ground, and how did the Bolsheviks in particular fight to make those things real. And so, when legal restrictions, were abolished on religion, race, or nationally oppressed nationalities, this is, just in one little sweep, that is something absolutely fundamental in a Russian empire where there was an absolute, people called it the prison house of nations, that sense of anti-Semitism, of racism, of women's, somebody mentioned upstairs about, the whip over the patriarchal marital bed in a peasant home. There were rules on the whip, it could only be as big as the circumference of the husband's thumb, which of course means the bigger and, stronger the man is, the bigger whip he can have. It doesn't seem, it's wrong in every way. But that sense of the nature of oppression, the reality of it, is something that, even just the first proclamations of what they wanted to change were an absolute challenge to everything that had gone behind. But when we look at the other side of it on the ground and what was going on in terms of the Bolsheviks trying to shape and create the situation to win people to furthering the revolution, to what they were doing, we do have to take into account the Marxist idea of, we make history but not in conditions of our own choosing, because tell you what, you wouldn't have chosen those conditions, would you? A situation where the working class was the minority, where there was such crisis, where you're talking about a country that was backward economically, apart from in, these central cities where it was in advance of many of the capitalist, already further developed capitalist countries. And so, therefore, when you look at a country dominated by peasantry and, where many millions living in what were effectively feudal conditions, not to mention that after the October Revolution into 1918, the breakout out of a brutal civil war to try and actually smash the revolution, these were the conditions under which the Bolsheviks were trying to fight for and create the conditions for a new society, for a social society. So when we talk about how it began, and people are familiar with the story, that at International Women's Day, women workers sparked the revolution by walking out, brought down the Tsarist dictatorship. And it's something that's, we have to sort of really, we can talk about it exploding, and it did, but it didn't happen out of the blue. the women had been active in the different strands of the revolutionary movement in Russia for many years. And, so this is when we talk about the objective conditions that the Bolsheviks found themselves. Yes, this economically backward country with a minority working class, but also they were part of a class that had experience of revolutionary struggle. So there's a contradiction there. I think somebody said this morning, they had years of the 1905 revolution and the years of struggle. And this steals a cadre within the working class in terms of what they've seen, even though, how tough the interim years were. So those two things. And so women workers and women activists were somebody who were absolutely central. In 1905, Alexandra Kollontai, a great Bolshevik leader and somebody who's very much associated with the role of women fighting back there, and also, as I gather from Cathy Porter, who's writing a new book about Kollontai, she was speaking in the previous session, that actually lots and lots of her writing are about lots of other aspects of the revolution, but she's particularly known for writing about women. As she said in 1905, there was no corner in which, in one way or the other, the voice of a woman speaking about herself and demanding new rights was not heard. So these are the women in 1905 who were still in the working class, who were fighting on International Women's Day. And one Tsarist officer in 1905, he said that working women were a store of combustible material. Now, that is true. But I just want to interject one thing, is that I think often when people refer to the beginning of the Russian Revolution in February, women are looked on as being almost an elemental force. Bread riots, protests broke out in the streets. And it's as if they weren't organised, as if it was really all the male workers were organised and the Bolsheviks were all run by men. And actually this is wrong. Number one, as we all know, it was a strike on International Women's Day. And that sense of actually the organisation of women workers being central to how it broke out. And whether it was the textile workers walking out, whether it was people walking out of bullying managers, or the laundry workers who threw water on their ovens in order to be able to, that no scabs would be able to come in. All of these workers were absolutely central, because if, we say a minority, some people say perhaps the working class was around 10% of the Russian population. You have a situation, say, in Petrograd, where because of conscription, there was an increasing in previous years numbers of workers in the factories. Some say a third, up to a half, nearly a half, by the time it came to 1917. And these were workers that the Bolsheviks organised among. And I think, I do think, that sense of the Bolsheviks, winning a cadre within the working class and also amongst women workers. It's also interesting, the point that was made in the last session, that when the women workers wanted to strike on International Women's Day, the Bolsheviks, leading Bolsheviks who'd been involved, said, no, don't do it. Number one, workers don't always think that the Revolutionary Party is right, and actually they're not always right. So that sense of the tension between the best workers saying, no, we're going to do it. And of course, the Bolsheviks got behind it, and, the rest is history. I'm not going to go through a chronology, but, within days, the fall of the Tsarist monarchy and the provisional government. But that sense of a tension between, the party and class, this isn't some abstract thing, the party up here, the class here. There is this relationship, and because the Bolsheviks understood that even when they were wrong, they would then run and try to catch up. They would see, because at these heights of struggles, when Lenin says people can perform miracles, of course this means that people are learning like this, and that sense of how they can be ahead of the party is something we have to be aware of. And I'm sure we've all got maybe our own experience of those things, even in the struggle at a low level that some of us might have experienced in recent years. But I think sometimes we can then leap to a shorthand. February Revolution, led by women workers, and then everything else can be sort of bunched into, there was a women's paper, and then there was a women's organisation, and, and they provided all these services for women, and then Stalinism happened, and it all collapsed. And it's understandable there could be a shorthand, because sometimes you don't have a lot of time. But I think it's maybe important to try and tease out that process about what happened and how really we did see a workers' revolution become a revolution that offered hope for everyone, offered hope for the millions around the whole of the extended Russian Empire. And one way to do that, there is a lot out there now of eyewitness and memoirs of people who fought and around, which I just think are absolutely fascinating and just give you a little bit of a sense of the turmoil and pull you away from that idea of some linear, predestined thing that was always going to be that way, of what it was like to be in the turmoil in the midst of a revolution. And one eyewitness, a student, Ekaterina, She talked about out in the Urals that it was very difficult to get publications. They didn't know what was going on. They knew that this amazing revolution was happening. And then they just clubbed together the citizens and demanded that actually all the organisations sent their periodicals and papers to their town, and they clubbed together to get them sent to the railway station, and then she brought them from the railway station, and then they all went to meetings and read them and talked about them. You know, it was this hunger to be part of something, even if you weren't in Petrograd, that I thought was fantastic. And I think another worker, Anna Leviko, a factory worker in Moscow, she describes the rallies and the meetings and debates in a square by the zoo where everybody stopped by on the way back from work to debate things. And at these rallies and at different factory rallies and workplaces, they'd have a table for the Mensheviks and a table for the Bolsheviks. And so some of them describe how they would sometimes argue day after day, well, what do you think? Are you going to join the Bolsheviks? Well, that guy, you know, the Menshevik, he said this, he said we have to be reasonable, he said that we have to just give a chance for the boss to change things and to give us a shorter shift. Somebody, well, I'm not going to wait for a shorter shift, they're getting it over there, you know. And so therefore that sense of real live debate on the ground that was shaped by the struggle and rising expectations, I think is fantastic. Anna in the end joined the Bolsheviks at the Bolshevik table, and that sense of then suddenly, you know, she sort of felt like she was part of something bigger. And another Bolshevik in the end talked about a woman, Sophia. She said, and I think it's a great description, she said, in those days people argued everywhere. On the shop floor, in the courtyard, in the streets, at home. If two people disagreed, a crowd would immediately gather around them. So interested were people in the main issues of the day. The policy of the provisional government, the war and the land. And so, you know, that sense of everybody feeling they had a stake in it, I think is something absolutely, absolutely vital. But it wasn't just about workers. And this is the thing, if we're talking about how the organisation of workers linked to the idea of the self-emancipation of the oppressed, the Bolsheviks also organised amongst the soldiers' wives, who, their allowances were intermediate, they were really poor with money, and you know, after the provisional, between February and October, they were sometimes going weeks without any allowances. And they were demanding from the provisional government more money, and the provisional government were doing the equivalent of sort of there's no magic money tree. And so Kollontai was going among them saying, form your own Soviet, demand your allowances. She wasn't saying, come to the Bolsheviks, we'll help you, or, you know, we'll be your saviour. She was saying, organise yourselves, because that's how you're going to be able to win. And I think all of this is the features, if you like, of a genuine revolution from below. And also the other features are things that actually, it wasn't all about money and shift length of time. You know, even things like, and it was being referred to, is that some women workers saying, we don't want to be searched at the end of our shifts. We don't want to be sexually harassed by bullying bosses. The waiter saying, we don't want tips and we'd rather you use the formal you instead of the informal you to us when we're serving you food. Now, this is something we've seen in the Spanish Civil War and other places as well. But that nature of people fighting against the petty humiliations that they suffered under capitalism were something that the Bolsheviks took up and were absolutely serious, and that understanding. You see, and I think, you know, people can think superficially there's contradictions. The Bolsheviks were internationalists, but yet they supported national liberation and national independence. I mean, on the 2nd of November 1917, the Declaration of the Rights of the Peoples of Russia meant that other countries within the empire were allowed to secede. And Steve Smith, who's written what is an excellent book, who's speaking in the final session, he says that 13 new states came into existence between October 1917 and the end of 1918. So it was a reality then. It wasn't just words, it was a reality of national independence being something important. And, you know, the Bolsheviks were also non-religious, but they absolutely supported the right of religious minorities. And I think this is absolutely vital because, you know, when you hear somebody in the Today programme saying Lenin waged a war on religion, you know, really, it's such a distortion of the reality, and it's something that we have to absolutely reject. I mean, this is what Lenin fought for on the Central Committee in 1921. He said that they were to issue this directive: emphatically avoid everything that would give a basis for any individual nationality to think, and our enemies to say, that we persecute people for their religious faith. And actually, I'll talk in a minute, you know, just about what happened in terms of Jewish people and the Muslim populations. But even things like the Christian sects, of which there were lots, and some of them were fairly big, he allowed them to avoid conscription. which is a big deal when you're fighting against the White Army, but on the basis that they would give something else in terms of their labour to the revolution. But so therefore that sense of understanding and saying we are on the side of religious peoples against persecution, not because they were religious, but because they knew that was a high that the revolution had to go forward. But when it comes to the Muslim populations, many Muslims joined the Bolshevik party after October. And this is what they were welcomed into the party. To the Muslim workers of Russia and the East was something that was a document issued by the Soviet government in November 1917. It said, Muslims of Russia, all you whose mosques and prayer houses have been destroyed, whose beliefs and customs have been trampled upon by the czars and oppressors of Russia, your beliefs, practices, your national and cultural institutions are forever free and inviolate. Know that your rights, like those of all the peoples of Russia, are under the mighty protection of the revolution. Now, isn't that something else? You know, and I think that when you look at the other side of things, the anti-Semitism that was absolutely fundamental to Tsarist Russia and the empire, it's absolutely fantastic when you just see that 5.5 million or more Jewish people emancipated to become free and equal citizens under the law after the October Revolution. And when the white armies who wanted to fight, you know, the revolution, when they led pogroms against Jewish people, in the Red Army, anti-Semitism was made a crime against the state, pogroms were outlawed, and any soldier, even in the midst of a war to save the revolution, were persecuted if they demonstrated any anti-Semitism in their ranks. No wonder that many Jewish populations moved with the Red Army lines for protection in order to avoid the pogroms of the whites. And so Lenin absolutely fought for the idea that Jewish people had to be completely incorporated and fought for and defended within the revolution. But when it comes to women, half the population, the oldest and deepest oppression within capitalist society, we have to see what they did, because it wasn't just enough to say that women workers led the revolution and they were part of the working class in Petrograd, because you had to look at this vast Russian empire in which, as I was saying, the vast majority of people lived in these feudal conditions. And actually, they fought all the way through 1917 and beyond, not only just with a paper for women workers. The first issue sold out, increased the print run to 50,000. And Kollontai, a year on, organised the first Congress of Working and Peasant Women in 1918, which people should read about. It's absolutely magnificent to see people travelling from all over Russia in order to take part and be delegated to this. One nurse from the Ural front who'd been there during the Civil War, she said, "Today, happiness was not a pretty dress or a cosy flat with a gramophone. It was at the front with the stricken and wounded." Because women felt utterly part of it, that they felt the superficial things that they'd aspired to even before the revolution were something they didn't think were important anymore. Now, this morning, Dave Sherry quoted from Lenin's speech 2 years on and about the pride he had and what they did for women's rights. And when he said, "We really razed to the ground the infamous laws placing women in a position of inequality," and he talked about how no other bourgeois society then had even got what they want today. Well, to be honest, it's still true. You know, not just 1 year after the revolution, 2 years after the revolution, 100 years after the revolution, this is still the case. For women's civil and legal and political rights immediately, the right to divorce. When Trotsky was asked, was it true that in revolutionary Russia that people could get a divorce just by asking, he replied that a better question would be, is it true there's still countries where this isn't the case? Right to legal abortion. I've written about this in my new book, but actually Alexandra Kollontai called it women's fundamental democratic right. Well, it's still in the criminal law in Britain today. Not, like John says, completely illegal like it is in Ireland, but we still haven't got the rights that they won in 1917. The principle of equal pay for women for equal work in 1917, we didn't get it here until 1970, and paid maternity leave, and I could go through the list. It's absolutely a fact that what they achieved in that short time was absolutely phenomenal. And at the same time, what in any circumstances would be an absolutely incredible programme of services and provision to try to lift the burden from women in the home of their domestic labour, which, remember, 100 years ago was much tougher than just putting a hoover around the living room. That this sense of the back-breaking, soul-destroying housework, which I think Trotsky writes about in a really poetic way, talking about women being the galley slave for society, that actually, even in the best of conditions, what they were fighting to provide would have been amazing. But in the conditions of civil war, of crisis, was absolutely phenomenal. The communal restaurants, laundries and nurseries that they built in Petrograd in 1919 to 1920, 90% of the population ate communally. In Moscow, more than 60%. And in 1920, 12 million town dwellers ate communally in state canteens. Now, these were not serving up cordon bleu delights. Let's not, idealise this. But actually, in some parts of the country, such was the crisis that people were eating moss and grass, that actually the state provision was something that was actually making a difference to people. The other aspect in terms of liberation for some of the most oppressed was literacy. Of the 17 million illiterate people in 1917, 14 million of them were women. Now, by 1926, almost half of women could read. A massive leap, but something that was vital if women were going to be able to fight for the revolution themselves, or to understand the arguments, to be part of the debate. These were tools that they needed. And I think all the other things, whether it's co-education schools and kindergartens for young kids and all the rest of it, sometimes Kollontai had to say, look, we're not stealing your children. We just want you to not have the burden in your individual family. Of course, lots of arguments. People were worried about some of the new developments and wondered what it would mean. But actually, the arguments are always about saying this is going to actually break it was a conscious strategy to break the material roots of women's oppression in the institution of the family. Some authors refer to it really, these provisions were just put in to ease transition, or maybe they were just expedient, to try and keep women on board. No, they were part of a conscious strategy. It wasn't just charity. Kollontai derided the idea of it was just philanthropy. She said you cannot empty out of the ocean of pain and misery created by the capitalist exploitation of hard labour with a teaspoon of charity. No, it was about politics. It was about how to win people. And I think if we are going to be able to smash the material roots of women's oppression and other oppressions, we have to talk about how this Festival of the Oppressed actually worked. And it wasn't a coincidental byproduct of a revolution. It was central to the project of the Bolsheviks, to knowing that if the revolution was going to be successful, they had to make it a Festival of the Oppressed. They had to ensure that the oppressed were there. And I think when it comes to sexuality as well, and others, I don't have time now to go into it, but there was the fact of decriminalising homosexuality many decades before this happened in other places was phenomenal. And I think the sort of debates that people had about sexuality, Eric Hobsbawm once said that it was actually, revolutions were mostly places where there was Puritanism. Well, this is far from the truth. Engels was more correct, saying the idea of free love comes up in every real social upheaval. And this is what was much more the case in terms of LGBT rights, in terms of women. And one psychologist said love in its physical aspect will no longer remain the erotic right and enjoyment solely of the male. But just to wrap up, you see, I think even with the laws and decrees, even with everything that went on the ground, even with the setting up of the women's department, the Zenital, which has been referred to, on which people went down the Volga and the trains, and the these agitational ways of both bringing literacy and politics to the far reaches of this vast country, including Bolsheviks wearing hijabs in order to go and work with Muslim women, inspiring and stuff. It's sort of what Trotsky said, the Bolsheviks had to turn formulas into flesh and blood, and this is what they were trying to do on the ground, and it is utterly inspiring. But of course it wasn't enough. Upstairs, Esme is talking about why the revolution failed. And I think that for us, when we look at the people who had so much to gain from the revolution, were some of the people who felt the counter-revolution the fastest, And I think this is where Trotsky writes so beautifully about the little things that he noticed, and he mocks the idea of motherhood being so suddenly lauded, the idea that suddenly abortion now becomes illegal, the idea that it's back to the old pots and pans, back to the old slavery, and he understood that that was a sign of the counter-revolution. But I think that what we have to say is the counter-revolution doesn't negate the revolution. Because the revolution still opened us up to what the possibility was, that workers can win power and actually they can make a difference and change. They made ordinary people the subjects of history, not the objects. And so my final point is this. I think today we meet not just to be nostalgic about this amazing thing, nor just to commemorate it, because we want to learn from it. It's about today, it's about the future. And when I've spoken before on anniversaries of the Russian Revolution, I hadn't stood in Cairo in 2011 in Tahrir Square. And when you read the eyewitness reports of the revolution in 1917, so many of it echoes, standing up at a lamppost, making speeches, saying we don't want to go home. saying that the May Day at Katerina said it was sheer boundless joy of a free people. This is what this is what a revolution looks like. This is what a festival of the oppressed feels like. And the Bolsheviks managed to win people, in Engels' phrase, to fight for a new society with their body and soul. Our job as revolutionaries today is to build an organisation that can do what they did for the 20th century. They created and built and led a revolution that shaped the 20th century. We have to build an organisation that can shape and lead the struggles of the 21st.